Welcome to episode 5 of Shaping Portfolio Agility, where we'll talk about healthy portfolio patterns. And this one's really exciting to me. Doing the Berlin Safe Summit talk. And this talk is really a lot of overlap and connection to what I'm going to be talking about in Berlin. So, if you remember in the last episode, we talked through the characteristics of different portfolios, what matters when you're designing and shaping change, and how to help leaders navigate the evolution as you go from where you are to that portfolio you want to be. Speaking of where you want to be, 2 episodes ago, we talked about different views into strategy and mapped to the different zones in Jeffrey Moore's Zone to Win. And in this episode, we're going to really bring those two things together. And we're going to talk about how to apply the examples to make sense of both the portfolio you have, where you are today, and to talk about where we are going over time as you have conversations as a leadership team or with your peers. So we'll start out a little bit with the nature of examples and how to use examples to, again, make sense of the world. And then we're quickly going to deep dive into the 6 different types of the portfolio examples that come directly out of the Scaled Agile Framework portfolio article. This was the new article introduced last year. I had the opportunity to help with the writing of it. And I'm really excited about the 6 different example types and how they can help you make sense of the scale and the size of where you play as a large enterprise. Mark, do you want to kick us off today?
Absolutely. So I've got to say, just in passing, the more we've talked about the process of the writing of that article of the examples, the more jealous I've got of the research you got to do, the exposure to a range of portfolio implementations. But getting back to the podcast, if you've been following the series so far, you'd know by now there's a mantra we have, which is you've got to start where you are. And in order to start where you are, you've got to know where you are. And a lot of the concept we've been talking about are really serving to give you kind of signposts. When you look at your portfolio, when you look at your ecosystem, what are the questions you ask yourself? And how do you start to characterize the ecosystem through those lenses? So, the first one we introduced was the concept of money, work, and people. Every portfolio is going to have responsibility for some blend of those things, sometimes with very different emphasis. When we got to Zone to Win, we talked about the various zones that Moore described. Is it in the performance zone, the productivity zone, the incubation, or the transformation zone? What are the implications of that? We've talked a lot about the idea of materiality. Um, and so getting to this picture of saying we want to build an understanding of our ecosystem. What are the portfolios? Why do they exist? What's their job to be done in service of the enterprise strategy? Who are they closely related to? And then how does that inform their evolution and their operation? So we're still in ecosystem land this episode. We're eventually going to get to the point where we dig inside a portfolio, but we're just sitting in that space of going, you've got to know your purpose, you've got to know your context. And the more clearly you know your purpose and context, the more that you can convey them internally and start to leverage that understanding. On which note, we'll throw over to Eric to take us a little bit deeper into the world of examples and how they might be helping.
So the examples I find incredibly useful because while Mark said we're not going to dig into the internals to any great depth, we do need to maybe come to the boundary a little bit more and really look at not just how you serve as a portfolio, not just what your landscape is around you in the ecosystem, which kind of shapes the expectations, shapes your responsibilities. But the idea that you need to go beyond that and say, okay, we are filling this type of role in the ecosystem. And because we're in this type of role, we can start to make some assumptions and have some better ideas about how we might want to structure us or structure ourselves. And that starts to let your ecosystem position inform your internal shape. And that's why I like to think about the boundary a little bit more. And we will get there. Like Mark said, we'll have deeper dives into the what it looks like to be in a portfolio and how to design it, and maybe even talk lower in the portfolio. But we need these examples in a way that help people make those initial choices. When you use something to make sense of where you are, you need to get those insights. We spent a lot of time, actually, we're going to spend a lot of time in the next episode talking about insights. But to generate those insights, we want something to drive that knowledge. And we wrote the examples to help people see themselves in one of a set of canonical types. Now, we played with a bunch of different words. And Mark, maybe before I dive into the decisions and why we made the decisions, I'm curious what comes to mind for you when you hear language like patterns versus examples versus archetypes is one of your words. What are some of the nuances you bring when you think about those different things and which word to choose?
So, look, I've often wondered why you didn't call them patterns. When the article came out and it talked about examples, I'm like, well, gee, they look like patterns to me. And of course, this is where I go back to my developer days in the late 1990s when the design patterns book came out from the Gang of Four.
Mhm.
And the power you got from a pattern was to be able to go, in this context, you should be thinking about these things, right? And it was literally a set of triggers to go, hey, here's a repeating pattern. You use this in these circumstances, and when you use it, you should think about A, B, and C. And there's a linkage there for me, of course, to the archetype, and archetype's a favorite word for me, right? Is the world is not full of carbon copies of the same thing. And there was an ad in Australia back when I was growing up where there was a very famous radio announcer advertising motor oils, and he had this saying of oils ain't oils. And and it was this notion that when you look at something, a portfolio is not just a portfolio, it's this particular type of portfolio. And if you can recognize the type of portfolio it is, then you've got a whole bunch of instant questions. It should probably be thinking about this. It probably should not be worried about this. Uh, so for me, I felt like examples was almost a soft word for it. And I'm curious why you landed on examples instead of, picking a stronger concept.
So there's a couple of driving forces there. One, we had the debate for sure. Like there was a decent amount of conversation about it. And one of the things the way I grew up, patterns are well researched, fully defensible things. And while certainly as we talk to literally dozens of companies about how they structure the shape of what's above and around a portfolio and how they think about the differences between portfolios, like patterns in the little p sense started to emerge. But I don't think any of us were really comfortable calling this collection of six the capital P patterns, in the sense that they were things you could pick up and they were completely portable and kind of stand alone, and you shouldn't really merge them. You should choose between them. Like a lot of the original design patterns weren't things you should mungle three of them together. The whole point was to make it clear and separate.
Yeah.
Um, and to your point, truly every company was unique. They None of them applied them in quite the same way. So while we saw recurring common themes over and over again, weren't quite ready to say, yes, we have developed the pattern language that exists for portfolio design. Heck, we with team topologies, I feel like we're barely getting to the point we're willing to do that for teams. And portfolios are wonderfully more complex than teams in that regard. So it is though, and you raised this as your example for archetypes. It is in a lot of ways the um, way to start knowing where to think, looking for those common characteristics and using it to start thinking about why we might approach something one way versus the other. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense in the context of what you've seen in the language you use?
So basically, you didn't want to overreach. An example felt like a more human readable word than archetype. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, we archetype, I believe, is on the list of prescribed words for hitting the target level of English. And I think that's actually an important thing. Like when we use words with incredible nuance, more and more I'm realizing how much we are losing our global relationship base, like people with English as a second, third, or fourth language, like the nuance of the word archetype versus pattern versus example. Example's the simplest of those words, and it kind of just works.
So let's beef it up, right? Because although you settle on example, not overreaching and not using strange technical language, to me, they gave, and the guidance in the article gave more than just an example. Um, let's talk a little bit about sort of going a level deeper. What are the implications of the examples?
So the implication in my mind starts to really get into your service orientation. Like as a portfolio, as you look at your position in the ecosystem and you look at frankly which zone you're in, back to the zone to win zones, your relationship with internal and external customers and the types of things you're pushing to create and do on behalf of the company start to take different shapes. And when we get into the six examples, we'll notice that a couple of them stand out as kind of more prominent than the others as far as the split. And not really foreshadowing too much. We're not that far ahead of ourselves. When we look at multiple portfolios, some of them tend to be more aligned to businesses and channels. Some of them tend to be more aligned to platforms and systems. And as you look across everything, in a lot of ways, that's the biggest, most obvious split. And we've talked about this without getting into the nuance of portfolios, probably half a dozen times in the series already. Like, if you're a business unit portfolio, you're looking for growth. You're looking for different ways to serve your customers. You're looking for more adjacent products. You're looking for a certain set of new things that the platform portfolio probably isn't. Meanwhile, the platform portfolio is going to be really digging for efficiencies and opportunities to serve better internally and more consistency across the enterprise and ways to serve special cases in more cost effective ways. They're going to be looking for a wildly different set of things. Um, so those characteristics, like understanding how you're going to start to orient, is kind of where I start. And there's a lot of other things I think you see that come out of it as well.
Yeah, look, and this will probably come out as we get a little bit deeper into the examples, but one of the things that I think when I look at the examples is almost a question of whether they're examples or attributes. There's a buzz phrase I picked up a few years ago working with a big name consultant called MESI. And, MESI is short for mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And when I look at a lot of portfolios, I actually see that you can characterize them through the lens of multiple examples. So
Mhm.
it's not necessarily the portfolio is a single type of example. There's a question of maybe there's a dominant example for it. And to me, it almost becomes a question of attribution. Um, and that's kind of the mutually exclusive part. But the collectively exhaustive part, do you feel like you covered every possible pattern, right? Somebody sitting down looking at their enterprise portfolio ecosystem would go, yeah, every portfolio we've got's one of these.
I would like to think so, and almost certainly we missed something. And I'm sure there's a dozen different edge cases that don't quite fit. In fact, one I'll talk about in my talk is justifiably could be any of three different examples as its primary. And I think the biggest thing here, as with anything related to agility, don't let the rules of a framework or the list of examples limit you. Like it's all too easy to say, well, this is what Scrum says we have to do, or safe structure says we have to do, and somehow holding yourself back by that as opposed to getting the benefits of it. And your company needs are the most important here. If your reality is that you are a platform that earns significant revenue and you're halfway between being a BU and a platform, cool. What does that mean for you? Not, no, you can't do that. You shouldn't be a portfolio. So, like, again, you start where you are and do what makes sense in your environment. Um, so as we transition into starting where you are, maybe let's jump on the most common starting condition.
So the most common starting condition is the single portfolio example. And my simple version of this is the company is the portfolio.
Hmm.
And to be honest, it's one of my favorites because I've generally over the last 10 years had a little bit of my work with smaller companies leveraging safe, and quite commonly a smaller company that's positioning to scale. And we go in, we launch an art, and I love these because stakeholders of the art or the business owners in safe speak tend to be the CEO and the executive team. And you get to management problem solving and you have an amazing discussion because all of a sudden you're seeing the tension between the various priorities come up, and you get this little kind of hotbed of what happens when sales meets channel operations meets product vision. And you discover very rapidly that if you try and give a little bit of each to each of those influences, you get nothing much of anything. And you really see where, you know, the demand of sales and your channel operations, for example, is compromising your product vision. And what often happens after you get a few of these is you get the executive team going, this is a great conversation. Why are we having it at such a weird time of day? Is it, late in the night of day one, or the one that's really sitting in my head was they had two VPs based out of Oregon in the States. The CEO and a couple more VPs were based out of Sydney, Australia. And then we had one dialing in from Cambridge in the UK. So management problem solving happened at 7 a.m. in the morning is the best blend across the three time zones. And I think it's amazing company strategy discussions at a very weird hour of the day. And so what happens is they start to creep that discussion upstairs. They go, well, actually, if we were willing to have a more rigorous discussion and think about the various competing influences on our company strategy, why don't we have that before we get to PR planning?
Hmm.
And of course, what's happening here is we're naturally shifting out of what are we doing in product development into what are we doing with our whole company. Right? What happens when all those needs intersect and we're getting a bigger conversation? And when we were just doing the quick pre-chat for the show, this is my favorite example. You went instantly to single portfolio, multiple arts, so a slightly bigger company. Do you want to take us a bit deeper into that one?
Yeah, well, first I want to just pile on. It's like I love those organizations you're describing. Some of my favorite clients are the ones that are small and they have those conversations. They can immediately start to see, oh, we need this kind of big room event and allow us to start to have meaningful whole business conversations around where we're going. And suddenly strategy just gets so clear to everybody. And remember, a lot of what we've talked about with portfolio is strategy at this point. So the reason why I made that jump is thinking about one company, I'm industry wide, I'm going to call them real estate management support. It's a very interesting category name, I'm sure, but I don't want to get too specific here. But they had about 1,000 people in their technology group, and they're still a single portfolio, and they had a couple different dominant strategies in play, but arguably it didn't quite make sense for them to split yet into multiple portfolios. There wasn't a clear strategic boundary. There wasn't like a clear platform to emerge because what the platform was what they sold, and they sold it into different segments through a couple different channels. Like there wasn't a clean break. They weren't really to major product number two yet, but they needed a boundary to talk about strategy and different sub strategies. And while still being a single portfolio, I think the main point we want to make here is twofold. One, this is healthy. It's okay to still be a single portfolio, even when you're starting to maybe stretch the bounds of big enough that you could split. And second, you can still use your arts, your different release trains as your boundaries for different strategies. So when you have a train vision, that can be a significant business strategy. It doesn't have to be just like this tiny little piece of something else. And they got a lot of really good power out of that. And what's interesting is their portfolio sync slash portfolio management approach was rapidly becoming that whole business steering element. It was just distributing across 1,000 people and 15 train equivalents rather than one. But I think maybe an interesting place to go from here is like, when do you split? Because that company was right on the verge, and there was a big debate about whether they should just partition it in a big way. How do you start to think about that?
I think the first thing in my head is when you start to think about split, it's almost guaranteed you're thinking about it too early.
It is probably really healthy, except for the one company that had 10,000 people in one portfolio.
So when you if you take a systems thinking lens, and this obviously is huge when you're thinking about strategy, part of your job in systems thinking is optimize the whole. And I'd always have a rationale that says if the whole you're optimizing is too small, you're probably doing local optimization.
Hmm.
And if it's too big, it's probably too abstract and fuzzy to generate meaningful insights and conversations.
Yep.
And that's the beginning to me, is to say, when you're having a portfolio conversation, is it feeling abstract and fuzzy? If it's starting to feel too abstract and fuzzy, and you're not really reaching clarity in terms of trade-offs, insight into the impact of your strategic guardrails, when half the people in the room are getting bored in half the discussions, it's either telling you one of two things. One of those things is you're getting stuck in the weeds instead of actually having a strategic conversation, and you're having the conversation at the wrong level. The other thing is maybe we've got the wrong composition in our portfolio.
Hmm.
Maybe we need to start to think about increasing the coherence. And sometimes you can increase the coherence by saying, look, we'll have particular sessions around pieces of our portfolio. Um, but it's kind of, for me, resist the urge, resist the urge, resist the urge until it becomes absolutely clear that there's a good reason for doing it. What about you?
Well, you hit on one of the strategies there. I think for getting started with it is when people want to split into multiple conversations and start putting ceremony around it, you might have just started identifying the seam and where you're likely to need to see a split. If 80% of the conversations are either group A or group B, and there's a handful that they all have to come together for, you probably just identified the big source of dependencies and kind of the two big likely subportfolios, or at least two arts if you're smaller. Um, but otherwise, I think a lot of it's what you're talking about is the right consistent degree of abstraction, the right level of conversation for most conversations in the portfolio. And I've seen the laughable ones where the same portfolio flow has a tens to hundreds of millions of dollar items in it and items under 100,000. And they're expecting there to be any meaningful attention on those tiny items. So, like, it's immaterial. It's like we can approve or not approve or delete that $100,000 item and nobody would notice at the executive table. That doesn't make a good executive conversation. Um, so I start to ask some of these questions around like how many layers, how many different levels of abstraction, how many buckets you need. Um, I, and to your point, I also have been a resistor. Like resist it until it hurts too much to not stay together, or to like, yes, we absolutely clearly need a split.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to put English in that one.
I think, and back to your comment about arts, is don't think you have to split a portfolio to split a strategy. If you're finding these smaller conversations, can you actually recompose your arts? And here's where we're starting to play a little bit internal. Can you
Mhm.
recompose your arts so that they are the containers of logical bounded pieces of your strategy? And I'd look at that long way before I looked at splitting a single portfolio. But I think we could geek out on this all day, and almost time to move on to talk about something
Yeah.
other than a single portfolio.
Yeah, there is one other moment I want to briefly mention because I've watched this play a couple times, but it didn't make it into the article. And this is when you recombine portfolios in advance of a larger change. So if you know your strategy is going to create stress and reorganization in your company, it may make sense to move those to be in a single portfolio first so that the next reorg that you know is coming anyway might become a little easier. But anyway, after that little aside, yeah, let's jump into our examples. So one thing we noticed in the pre-read or the pre-recordings of these in our first pass is the examples actually line up really well to the different zones. So we're going to take a lens through the rest of this show on Jeffrey Moore's Zone to Win, the four different zones that Mark introduced during the opening. And I think the first four things we'll talk about, three specific examples and a couple sub examples, are all going to be in the performance zone. So just to refresh, the performance zone is where your revenue comes from. It is the bulk of your income. It is the business units and channels and that nice, neat interlocking grid that um, helps to create accountability when the two are in conflict. And each element of the performance zone needs to be material, and materiality being 10% of your overall revenue. Most of your profits, if not all of your profits, come from the performance zone. Um, Anything you want to add to that summary before you take on the next example, Mark? Or-
No, I reckon we did a whole episode and geeked out
Yeah.
pretty hard on the performance zone there. So, let's jump into, the dominant example of the portfolio, the performance zone, which is the business unit portfolio. And, one of the things that we wound up having a random chat last week and went, if we were trying to build an example of a portfolio ecosystem, we could probably just look at the website of a large enterprise, um,
Mhm.
look at their communications to shareholders, and look at what we can see of their structure externally, and you can almost guess what their portfolio structure is going to be. And it was a fun conversation because we're forever trying to hunt for examples that don't betray confidentiality from our past experience, and sometimes tie ourselves in knots trying to abstract it enough. But it's like, oh, wouldn't it be great to just build an example for a company neither of us has ever worked with? So if you think about a business unit portfolio, this is the classic. What are your lines of business?
Yep.
And you know, typically they're oriented around a product or a service. If you're a bank, for example, you might be talking retail banking, institutional banking, uh, first lens, and it really ties up to your P&L. Um, I might throw back to you, Eric. I mean, I know you had so much fun doing the research on this.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is most of these are actually obvious. Not all, but to your point, like coming in from the outside as a consultant, I largely can walk into a company having done, or at least a publicly traded company, having done just a little research, looked at their website. The old joke used to be read the sub items of the first two drop downs on their website. And modern websites and design has shifted that over the 10 years we've said that. But I remember back since like 2011, we used to just go to a company website, drop down the first two drop downs, list it out, and it's like, okay, there's your major business units. And be 80 to 95% correct right there because everybody already knows these things. We just love to overcomplicate them. Um, it is important though to dodge a little bit of nuance. It's not about your org chart per se, and it's really easy to say, "Oh well, this is clearly then everybody under SVP Michelle." Well, yes and no. Yes, and also the supporting business and sales and go to market and marketing and accounting and like and all the rest of the stuff necessary to run that business, who may not all report there. They might report through the COO or chief people officer or somebody like that. So, with that caveat, I think it's pretty straightforward. And if you're listening to this, you're probably already thinking, of what those divisions are in your company. If you're a telecom or an insurance company or maybe a bank, they're probably your things you sell to businesses versus the things you sell to individuals. Classic split example. Um, Enterprise software company I worked for, each business unit was its own portfolio. Each business unit had a suite of software that largely targeted a different overlapping subset of the enterprise market. Mark, you've got it. You have more examples you want to add, or
Look, I think I would just go back to, and the org chart portfolio structures is a personal bugbear for me, because there's so many times where you go, if I'm an executive, and in America that generally means if I'm a VP. In Australia, it might mean my title is director. Um, and fundamentally, it's I'm important enough to have a portfolio. Tends to be the org chart portfolio anti-pattern. But there's a really good lens, and maybe this is back to the question of are the examples exhaustive? I think maybe there's a nuance which says is the example recognizable but a bad example? And the performance zone gives us a good hint, right? Is it 10% of your
Mhm.
revenue? Right? So it's a BU
And does
portfolio
it have revenue?
and it's 10% of your revenue. Well, it's probably a good example of a BU portfolio. If it's a portfolio that you think's a BU portfolio, but it's got nothing like 10% of your revenue, maybe you're asking yourself a different question.
Yep. And I think the other one is, especially to avoid the org chart portfolios, is are you actually an end-to-end profit stream? Do you earn money through your portfolio in its entirety? And you might be supported by other portfolios, and there's going to be other parts of the enterprise serving you in order to do so. But if you're only a portion of that stream, you might want to challenge yourself. You might have actually fractured your organization into functions rather than helpful end-to-end portfolios.
So let's jump across a little bit, right? Because one of the things that Zone to Win really suggests in the performance zone is you've got to link BU and channel.
Yeah.
And in the article, you don't see an example, which is a channel portfolio. We've started with a kind of code word of it's example 2A, a channel portfolio. Why don't you take us a little bit deeper into that one?
Well, I think most common of these is probably obvious to a lot of people is what about a company that has a traditional business model that has also made the leap to digital and has a digital sales channel and that layers on top of the existing business. But because of the wild variance in technology spend, it is justifiably the size to be its own portfolio. Is that channel digital its own portfolio? It's not a business unit per se. Some companies try to treat it that way, but it is a channel that represents 10% of your revenue if you're doing it right. And I think that still meets the intent of a performance zone for sure, and a business unit portfolio. And that digital channel might serve multiple technical BUs, like it might sell personal lines and professional lines and whatever else if you're an insurance company. But it's still material and it's still end to end and it's still implementing the business from that point of view. Um, the challenge, and I think you and I have both seen this and had a couple fun conversations. So I'll share the challenge and then maybe let you tell a story. Is when the two both treat themselves as primary and they both have portfolios and they don't know how to work together. So you've got the crisscrossing elements of your matrix not coordinating and not communicating well with the cells.
Uh,
Uh,
Look,
yeah.
I actually had a lot of years where I was an absolute hater of digital portfolios or digital arts. Uh, and it was my go-to thing as soon as I looked at something and went, that's a digital portfolio. I went, here comes the dysfunction.
Hmm.
Tension and disconnect between the digital people and the actual real product in market,
Yep.
and all kinds of horrible things. And the first time I really got challenged on it was actually the first deep interaction I had with Rebecca Davis, and she was sharing her digital portfolio at CVS, and I took one look at it. I said, "Digital portfolio, it's wrong." And then she proceeded to educate me. Uh,
I had that same moment with her.
so, there's a reality that says there are times when you need digital coherence, and particularly around concepts like some of your core enablers, right? Your booking systems for appointment booking. The digital enablers that become reusable, establish brand consistency across your different BUs. That was one of the huge things she was doing in her portfolio. So, there's an argument to be had that says you can have a legitimate digital channel portfolio. But I think the risk is to say everything digital goes in the digital portfolio, as opposed to recognizing the things that really need that logical coherence. And this is where there's a really good clue when you start to go back to the performance zone and more, because he has this idea of the performance matrix, and his columns are the channels, his rows are the BUs, the intersections of those are the cells, and he really puts forward the idea that you need dual accountability. Any given intersection between a BU and a channel needs shared accountability for the KPIs between the channel owner and the BU owner.
Mhm.
And you can start to then say, where are the logical intersection points, but maybe not just a single cell. Because if you do the maths, if you've got 10 BUs at 10% of your revenue each and 10 channels at 10% of your revenue each, that's 100 cells, that's 100 portfolios. Life is madness. But when you look through that lens, often you can find logical clusters. And these logical clusters can start to highlight where you perhaps have channel synergies. And
Mhm.
whether it's a digital channel synergy, or let's say it's bricks and mortar channel, multiple products being offered through the same set of retail outlets. And
Yep.
starting to think about which cells in the performance matrix does my portfolio cover starts to become really interesting. Do you want to add anything on your personal bugbears there?
Well, I'm on record in a couple different publications with that, so I didn't just feel it. I also wrote about it. So enterprising people can go find that if they want to rub it in my face that I used to hate digital portfolios and digital arts. Um, but it's also the opportunity. And when you're looking at the performance zone, I think these opportunities are critical to think about to be creative in how you shape it. And one example I have of this that I love is a retail organization that gave the entirety of its um, call it the checkout process, but shop buy and close the deal to the same portfolio, whether it was in the store or online, because they really wanted to make sure there was a seamless transition experience if you wanted to buy online, return in store, variations on that theme. And that wasn't easy when the two are using wildly different technology stacks, wildly different process framings, different accounting approaches, and so on. So they actually made the revenue aspects of both into a common portfolio, but then they also had a separate piece for some of the store positioning and the advertising and the marketing for the digital channel, and a separate piece for the retail organization and supply chain and positioning and all that. um, that wasn't all slurped together, because one of the negative patterns I saw was once you have good digital organization, it just becomes the new IT and all technology goes there. And we didn't want to see that either. So they actually played it really well to create a very good, consistent customer experience across the multiple channels through the digital org, while digital not trying to take on everything for everybody. And I really love that balance.
All right, so we've got balance, we've got BUs, we've got channels, we've got blends of BUs and channels. That's all example two. What about moving along to regional portfolios?
Yeah, and we're skipping. So this is example four. If you read the article, it's out of order because of prominence, but it's still a performance zone. And I think this is the case for any multinational company that's trying to do meaningful business in a variety of different regions. And if you're just a digital product, a digital company or a product company who sells the exact same thing in all the regions, this may not apply to you. But if you're customizing your products, if you're releasing variations of products, if you materially have to do business in different ways in different regions, Um, Most likely, you're ending up with some small local technology investment in order to custom fit for that region. But you get the competitive advantage of having the parent company, the technology stack as a whole, available to help you serve your market. And you're really struggling to find this balance between use the enterprise completion thing as is because we don't want to spend the money locally, we're a small market, and balancing that against the need to be custom and unique and serve our local market in a unique way, for cultural reasons, governmental, regulatory reasons, whatever. So the regional portfolio is created and identified as an example of how to do that. And these tend to be incredibly closely connected to their business. You don't see the business IT split in regional portfolios. It's more often corporate and us is the mindset split you see in the field. You've got the parent company, which is half a world away, and you need the ability for local autonomy, local operations, local decisions, and in manufacturing company examples, local production and design, while still leveraging all the learning and engineering skills and the mastery generated in the parent country. Um, so I don't know how much more you want to say to that. One of the Before I hand it over to you, Mark, one other comment. These are often tiny. So when you talk materiality, these might be like 1% of the size of the main portfolio that they emerged from. So there's a very big size difference here that doesn't apply in most of the other examples. But with that, Mark, anything you want to add there?
Look, I think it feels like every time we open one of these, we start talking about tensions.
Hmm.
And, the tension I was, as you were talking about the them and us mentality, I was just reflecting back on various clients and the them and us mentality. Um, but, these potential tensions, if you come back to why are these examples useful in the ecosystem, one of the questions you ask yourself is, okay, well, it's one of these examples. What turns up when I look at it through this potential tension or synergy lens? Um,
Hmm.
and you know, most of the places I see, and this again comes back to a little bit to materiality. If you're a regional portfolio, what size is the region? Is the regional portfolio for a single country? Is it for a collection of countries? Because again, if you're thinking in the ecosystem, you're wanting kind of similar materiality. And one of the things that's very common is in let's say you're a US company. Yeah, US company, you've got BU portfolios for every distinct key line of business, but then you've opened operations, let's say in Australia, New Zealand. At that point, maybe you've got an Australia, New Zealand portfolio, and every line of business collapses inside that portfolio. So there's an aggregation. But then you still might be in a case where Australia, New Zealand really doesn't belong in the same conversation as the US. So
Hmm.
maybe it becomes Australia, New Zealand, and Asia Pacific. So there are some kind of threads that'll come out, and this is again coming back to the concept these things aren't messy. There's a truth that says a regional portfolio will probably have a bundle of BUs contained in it. A BU portfolio will probably have a bundle of regions contained in it. And so what you're looking for is what's the thing that dominates the reason for existence of this portfolio, and the presence of multiple regions or multiple BUs might give you some clues what you're doing and looking at when you internally structure it. But what's the first lens with which you think about it? Which
Well,
go.
it it's there's two or three different things. One is first an observation before we even get into a lens, and that is when you're in the big home country, you tend to refer to the collection of regional portfolios. You don't even necessarily day to day honor them with individual names because you've got 30 of them. Whereas if you're in one of those regional portfolios, you are the center of your world, by you should be. You're aware of the two or three around you in the ecosystem that share the same continent or similar governmental and legal jurisdiction behaviors or some commonality that is important. Maybe you're just the same part of the world in the supply chain sense. or the same dominant language family like South America. Um, so you're aware of the local regions, but you're not necessarily aware of the other 27. They're there, but you don't pay attention to them. So that's a little bit different of a relationship mindset than you see in many of the different portfolio relationships with each other. And in the pictures I've drawn on this, there's like kind of just a collective box around regional portfolios. And to your point, um, almost always I see the different lines of business come together into a regional portfolio.
Yes.
I was, as you were talking, I was trying to think of more than one example where they're separate. And the only one I could think of that they're separate is an automotive organization that had their commercial vehicles and like big trucks separate from their small automobiles, even in other regions. But other than that, I'm struggling to think of a single insurance or banking example where it wasn't unified at the regional level. The other thing I'd then think about is the market big enough to justify building its own technology or should they share? And I know at least three different insurance companies that have global operations, but they still, from a technology point of view, treat all of basically sub Saharan Africa as a single region. They draw a circle around the Mediterranean, do all the Mediterranean countries, they do sub Saharan Africa, and then they have named um, national portfolios for like Germany and England because those are huge markets. And I think they have France. So some those kind of nuances start to match with your stories, or is it different sitting where you're sitting in one of our regional portfolio? Oh, sorry.
No, absolutely. They fully match, and I think the comment I'd make would be when you're thinking about regional portfolios, because quite often they're such minnows, is if you go back to the discussion we had about single portfolio and when to split and why, eh, it probably carries through pretty strongly when you think about the discussion we've just been having about regional. But there's one more special case, and there's a special case which is the regulatory and risk portfolio, which in many cases actually has a lot of synergy with a regional portfolio. And I know when I first read this, I had a mental model that said reg and risk portfolio. We're talking about group risk and security. And then Eric went, "Yeah, stop your mental model right there." So,
But it's a challenge because you're absolutely right that companies treat security as a regulatory thing. But that's not what we're talking about here. So anybody who's listening, that's not what we're talking about. Stop your mental models that Mark just talked about. Um, what we're really looking at here is two different businesses, and this is why they're in the performance zone. If it was a regulatory security portfolio, it wouldn't be performance zone, that would be productivity zone. But what we're talking about is two different businesses that have materially different risk exposures due to the nature of what they sell. And that gradient, if you don't partition around it, basically takes whatever the lower governance level area is and drags it to the slowness and speed and regulatory constraints of the higher risk one. And there are examples of this across the board. Classic, I think, is if you're making medical devices. In the US, we have multiple classes of medical devices, and we also have medical device companies that sell a few consumer goods that are related to their devices but aren't actually controlled things. If you force everything in the company to go at the speed of a Class A medical device, you're never going to compete on anything except for Class A medical devices. So you create a partitioning where there's a regulatory regime in the company for one type of product and a different regime, a different governance structure for a different set of products. And when you start to do this, you start to get different speeds in the organization where each can move as fast as it can. There's a few other variations, but I'll pause there and see if Mark has comments to add in.
no, look, I think they're great examples. But the other one I'd go to, because that's really that you're talking a risk profile, right?
Hmm.
And it's separation of risk profile so that everything doesn't slow down. I think for me, the other example is sort of leaning more into the regulatory lens, which is quite often there's a regional influence on regulatory considerations, right? FDA in the US, not the
Mhm.
FDA, but many other regimes elsewhere. So starting to look through the kind of patterns of regulatory constraint and consideration around your boundaries can be really useful.
It is. The big one that I've seen that actually drives more splitting of portfolios than not that's regional is financial law.
Yeah,
And especially the fact that many times your regional portfolios are actually also separate operating entities.
yeah,
And to align the boundaries of that operating entity against your investment portfolio from a technology point of view makes life infinitely easier because you already have to report in each and every financial transfer across those national boundaries. So why not align those instead of taking the pain? That might be the at a global level the one caveat to the don't use your org chart is if it's across national boundaries, you might want to use your org chart.
yeah. The other one I've
um,
seen there
Good.
was retail versus wholesale, uh, and that might seem weird on first glance because yeah, well, is that just kind of your channel strategy? But if you've got perhaps anti-monopoly laws, or you know, enabling competitive fairness, and you have a large enterprise that wholesales to other large enterprises at the same time as having its own retail offering. Certainly in Australia, there tend to be some very tight legislative rules around ensuring that the wholesaler offers the same terms to other enterprises as to its own retail branch. Uh,
Yep. So definitely have seen variations of that. You're starting to get into similar ones with the conflict of interest of say a investment management versus a more general banking functions. If you're in a financial organization where you can't actually share your client information across some of the walls because they're treated as privileged information. You might see some client-based splits. I know one organization that builds military aircraft and also builds commercial aircraft. There are some really cool technologies that not only can I not talk about them, they couldn't tell me about them, so I don't even know about them because and those have to stay in the military area. And they can't actually even collaborate with their peers in the commercial space around those technologies. Like the commercial space intentionally tries to avoid it. So I could tell really fun stories. A lot of my early career here was in a lot of the regulated spaces, so aviation and medical devices. Like that's I love to geek out on that, but I think we're probably at a good few minutes behind schedule opportunity to move into the productivity zone, Mark.
I had a feeling we wouldn't manage our timeline too well this episode because,
Oh well.
oh well, and it's important stuff. So just before we leap on, and a reminder here, we said at the beginning this episode was going to be about the ecosystem. But if you look at the various examples we just talked about in the performance zone of BU versus region versus regulatory and risk, these examples serve both as a way of characterizing your portfolio and characterizing the internals of your portfolio. And they're very powerful in both usages. But enough on the performance zone. Let's talk about the productivity zone. Um, Many agilists would say this is the boring zone.
Their
In fact,
loss.
but the productivity zone is hugely important because this is the zone that enables your performance zone to perform. Uh, the focus of anything in the productivity zone is going to be enabling margin improvement, cost reduction, speed to market, uh, and really servicing the performance zone. And that's what exists. Make the performance zone more productive. And the first example that we characterized here was actually the platform portfolio. And platform's another one of those words that I get a bee in my bonnet about, almost as much of a bee in my bonnet as I used to about the digital portfolio, because it's so common for people to say they have a platform strategy that doesn't necessarily resemble a platform strategy so much as a center of dependency health. so let's talk about the good examples of platform portfolios you found in your research, Eric.
I think the best examples were the ones where entire business capabilities were created and operated by that portfolio. And these took a lot of different examples. It could be at a credit card company who has a card processing platform, but also includes all of the regulatory, security, everything necessary to offer that both to its internal divisions that then deliver that on forward, but also to fintechs and other startups that want to, ideally as part of their platform strategy, cough, um, rely on their card processing and their underlying capabilities instead of going to one of their competitors' underlying capabilities. So that actually has some customers and not just internal stakeholders. In the insurance world, claims platforms. I know of several companies that both operate their claims as a separate, almost strength of a business unit. Like they have their own staff, they have their claims operations center, but it's in service to all the products, not just one business unit's products. So it on the org chart kind of looks a lot like a business unit, but it's business and technology and everything necessary to create and operate that claims platform, to the extent that I know of at least one that has deployed an entire business around insurance operations extending from its platform, and another that purchased a claims processing or purchased a third party claims platform company to make it part of their company, acquired it, but still maintain the other customers. Like, so I've kind of seen that one actually go both way from a spin-off and a acquisition path. The key part here is it's not a function. It's not just the technology piece. It's not just the people in the call centers. It's building that business capability as if it's a whole solution, the same way we talk about whole products. And I think that's the good versus bad boundary that I almost always see with platforms and makes me okay with them. Because I have, as with many of these things, I had the same hangups you did. It's like, oh, you build a thing that everybody else relies on. Great. Thanks for
And
slowing us
everybody
down.
jumps in the queue. But I
Hmm.
think if you take that great example and you go, that's actually a metaphor I should apply to everything. And for me, the easy example of a platform portfolio that everybody would recognize would be AWS. Right.
Perfect. Which
A-
is actually a business unit now.
Right. So Amazon created it to service a set of internal customers. They were very customer centric in doing so, and then they recognized an opportunity to productize it and serve a set of external customers. And that for me is the most important aspect of a platform portfolio is you've got to know your customers. You've got to understand, and I think through the lens of B2B or B2B2C, right? Your customers are generally the performance zone. They may expand not just to the performance zone internally, but direct to external customers. But you've got to be driving a strategy that says, who are our customers? Where are they trying to go? And how can we help them get there?
Hmm.
And, another great one I've seen there is actually cloud platforms.
Yep.
And, when you think about a enterprise cloud transition, it's a very complex thing. And I was working with one company who literally they had thousands of applications they wanted to port to the cloud in various styles or depths of migrations. Their industry regulator had to sign off on the migration of every single asset that went through to the cloud through a
Mm.
risk perspective. And so one of the things that the platform portfolio did was that it actually developed patterns that expedited that regulatory sign-off process.
Mhm.
Hi, you're one of these things, you're going to have to go through these regulatory hoops. Therefore, we have this variation of our platform that's going to support expediting that process. So,
That's awesome. My first variation on one of those was actually a service-based offering to help companies transition from Lotus Notes to the Microsoft stack. And same set of dynamics that were in play of like these are easy, these are more complex, these are the special case ones. Here's the patterns to apply, like all kinds of accelerators.
So let's jump off to the other big one, right? If that's platform portfolios, the most prevalent, I would argue, example of productivity zone portfolios is your corporate systems portfolios. Is this
It's
your finance system, your HR system, your employee experience systems? Um, and I know when we started chatting about this, um, I think I went to one set of examples and went to a different set of examples. Um, what else would you throw in there?
mm, really it's for me it's the entire set of things that you would never and could never sell externally. Um, that don't necessarily, in most cases or any cases, interact directly with customers as a general case. There might be some weird side cases. So, yeah, HR, finance, maintaining the general ledger, um, telephony, maintaining your Cisco relationship because that's how you do your corporate things, keeping the internet turned on for the company. Like, there's a lot real estate and real estate management if you have a lot of physical holdings. There's just a lot of stuff companies have that is kind of the keep the lights on of an enterprise as opposed to of a product. And that's the way I kind of look at it. And why its own portfolio becomes relevant. One is the level of materiality is so low in most cases compared to any of your business facing portfolios. And two, they have just a very different mandate, a very different set of goals. And my favorite example, VP that led that group and at one of the companies I was with, reduced his team from close to 1,000 to 47 people over 4 years, and he saw a path to reduce it to eight by using software as a service, by outsourcing not unimportant, non-differentiating pieces, and in the same process, his internal customer satisfaction scores were actually several points higher on a 1 to 10 scale. So, like, this is the strategy there is wildly different than any of those strategies, but it would be a distraction for it to be the executive conversation of a business unit. It's something that literally you should have a VP just take and go do and tell everybody else what's being done to them, and then argue through the exceptions when you have to. Oh, in
So,
the process, he also freed up tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of data center spend. Just to add that on as icing.
so it's fair to say, right, a corporate systems portfolio, and one of the things that you'd see in the productivity zone, generally your KPIs are going to be about cost out, right?
Yep. But
There'll
then
be a
with
link
this,
to, speed enablement. But if it's a productivity zone portfolio and you're not looking at cost reduction KPIs, you're probably going to be pretty surprised.
yep. And I do want to highlight a common theme we see across these that we didn't really call out, but it's important. Every one of these platform portfolios still has a strategy. It still has strategic themes that are often both operational and transformative in some dimension. So it's not that these are just boring platforms, it's that their strategies are in service to something else or somebody else in the company.
And if I could tell stories, I'd tell some wonderful stories about that. But I did some thinking and I couldn't find enough a way in which to safely tell them. Um, but let's say a good way to think about that strategy as you start to form it is to go and have a very deliberate set of structured conversations with your performance zone portfolios and say, where are you trying to go?
Mhm.
And then come back and say how we're going to craft our vision in terms of the way in which we're going to enable the performance zone to do what it wants to do.
Yep.
And sometimes it's very difficult to make a productivity zone strategy exciting. But we went through that exercise with one organization, and they actually compiled snippets and abstracts of the strategy of the performance zone, and they linked it and said, this is how we're going to enable that. And it started to become more exciting than this is what we're going to do to reduce cost.
No
Um,
kidding. One thing that I want to just call out very clearly, though, is it's easy to hear this, I think, as an order taker mandate. Do what this portfolio, do what these productive, I'm sorry, do what these performance zone portfolios want you to do. And that's kind of the opposite of having a strategy. Your strategy isn't just to take orders. In fact, the best productivity platforms I've seen are the ones who go out and say, I've listened to your business strategy. I see and hear and understand where you're going. What would you do differently if we could give you this capability? And really say, we can contribute to advancing your strategies in ways you hadn't thought about. If only we go and build this addendum to our experience platform, or this, oh wait, you want to expose that to third parties, we could easily wrap that in APIs and monetize them. What would you do with that? And it just changes the conversation if you're in service in that way.
all right. Speaking of getting exciting and creative, let's jump across to the incubation zone. And, the incubation zone where innovation happens, which leads us, of course, to example 6 from the article, which is the innovation portfolio. And, I'm going to go with the first strong reaction people might have is, well, innovation should happen everywhere. What happens if you create a innovation portfolio? Does that mean all innovation has to happen in that place? Or, you know, how do you prevent the misconception of it?
No, clearly you then have to come get their board of innovation's approval before you're willing to try anything new. No, not serious there. The answer is yes, of course everybody innovates. But 2 episodes ago we talked about 2 different types of innovation. We spent some time talking about disruptive innovation versus sustaining innovation. If you're in productivity zone, you're in performance zone, absolutely innovate. But your innovations most of the time are going to be local to either how you work, developers improving their local environment, small like capability based innovations, or they're going to be innovations directly related to your current business model. Maybe introducing some adjacencies and going after adjacent markets, things like that through feature level sustaining innovation. Incubation zone's about the big stuff, the disruptive stuff, the things that won't and can't happen in your existing business units and your existing portfolios because it's just so dang disruptive and different. And nobody wants to touch it. And yet, how many companies have we seen that have reinvented themselves and become something new through a variety of different techniques? And that's really what we're talking about with the incubation zone innovation portfolios. And there's a couple different dominant patterns I've seen. And Mark, I think you might have some other stories here. I'm going to leave it open afterwards. One is the tiny little VC fund, that venture capital fund that is essentially running tiny companies inside the parent company. I got to be a part of one of these one time. We went up against Shutterfly. It didn't go well. They won. And we got spun off as a component that eventually became part of, I think it's now sitting in Snap My Life as one of their feature capabilities. Great example. Build a product, didn't scale, went somewhere else. Had nothing to do with the parent company's activities, but they had several of those things going and they were willing to spend a little bit of money on it. And I've seen several companies that kind of have that internal VC capability to try to find the next big winners and see if they become material or they recycle the founders into other interesting roles. The other big use, before I turn it over, is acquisitions. You're bringing a new company and you're buying a company that is a different business model than you, but has the potential to have I hate this word sometimes, but a massive synergy with your existing operations has the potential to be something new and material and within a few years be well over 10% of your operating income. But it needs some time to incubate and become a part of the business and adapt to the culture and see where it fits and so on. And it's nice to have a place for those companies to land and go through the process before they try to emerge as business units of their own right. What other patterns or examples? Because this one's more innovative in its nature, pardon the overuse of the word.
Yeah, look, I think I would jump instantly to that notion of other companies. And I must confess my eyebrows went up when you said you use it for acquisitions until you finished explaining. But I've seen a very common pattern where there's a very partner oriented innovation strategy. And, it's a big enterprise and it is fundamentally investing in startups. Uh, and it's taking stakes in startups. It's supplying some support and guidance to the startups, and really, it's running a portfolio of co-fund operations of, hey, we've got plays at place in these things, and we're setting a scene that says if one of those takes off, then we're positioned to absorb it into the mothership and take it to scale. Uh, but it gives access to people, ideas, and technology beyond its own boundaries. So I've seen that incredibly commonly. Uh, um,
You have me wondering how the OpenAI relationship is structured inside Microsoft.
yeah, yeah, it'd be lovely to be able to talk about some of the real examples I've seen of that. But I've seen them both ways, right? I've worked with smaller clients who were on the receiving end of being part of this the innovation portfolio from a big enterprise. I've certainly worked with some big enterprises who've done it. I, and I know when we talked about zone to win and the incubation zone, we actually went on quite a bit in that episode about the various things you get from starting to see a collection of innovation concepts collected in one place and thinking about, if I'm investing in disruptive innovation, what's the spread of investment, right? Am I over indexing to one area? Am I actually paying attention to a range of opportunities? That's the discussion you want to create in the portfolio. Is not a discussion about any particular innovation, but it's a discussion to say, well, what are the plays we've got? Where are we playing? And which ones of them are showing signs of life? And which ones do we need to find an exit strategy for? And again, in the Zone to Win episode, we talked our way through the 4 different exit strategies. So, despite the fact we're both very excited by innovation and knowing that we're now well and truly over our usual podcast time box, I'm going to jump us over to the transformation zone, and I'm going to jump us there pretty fast because Eric gets so excited about the transformation zone. He's writing a whole book about it.
It is, and it's really interesting when we started mapping the zones to the portfolio examples. First three were pretty straightforward, but when we got to transformation zone, I was like, well, where does this fit? In fact, on our note cards, there's still a couple question marks after it because we didn't clean up our notes. But it's like, where is the transformation zone in a portfolio example? And the answer is it depends and it's temporary because the whole point of a transformation zone is to be something that's influx from small and immaterial to material and essentially running as a performance zone portfolio. And maybe I can make a couple of side cases where a new platform strategy might end up in the productivity zone, but we're going to leave those out for the moment. The whole point here is you might acquire a company and then try to pour resources in and grow it rapidly, in which case it hits the incubation zone innovation portfolio, is there briefly, and then rapidly becomes its own portfolio as it tries to become a BU. Um, or it might be something where a internal platform, has a path to being material from a revenue point of view. Think AWS again, or again the credit card processor that's releasing APIs and becoming its own business unit separate from the main processing pathway or something like that. And you're essentially driving a piece of a platform portfolio to being its own material thing. And that starts to become a really interesting. Um, Now, what's a little different here, and we alluded to it, I think, in the last episode or two, is this is the case where we actually don't say start where you are as strongly as we do all the other times. Um, this is the case where you might actually say we're going to intentionally and purposefully grow a new portfolio out of a single, perhaps very large value stream. And we want to be here. We want to have this business unit portfolio that's accounting for 22% of our income based on our last set of projections. So, what do we need to do to get there? And what is the sequence of maneuvers that are going to be necessary if we're successful in traversing our transformation journey? And transformation, not in the agile adoption, not in the business digital transformation, but in the like material shifting the nature of our business type transformation. Um, and I could keep talking about this and will keep talking about this for several hours in various forums, but um, if you don't want the 50,000 words right now, we can maybe wrap it up, Mark.
So if you take the short version, right? The short version is in the transformation zone, you may well have something that's emerged from your innovation portfolio in example six.
Yep.
You may have something that's emerged from a BU portfolio using example two as a material
Yep.
disruptive take to scale. The other one, just to really throw it out there and be contentious, is you might find a portfolio from the productivity zone in the transformation zone.
Yep.
And, obviously you could jump to the idea of the platform portfolio and the AWS example. But the other one is to think that, more when he talks about the transformation zone, he runs this metaphor of going, are you playing zone offense or zone defense? Right? Zone offense, you're ahead of the market and trying to expand the lead. Zone defense, you're behind and you're trying to catch up. And he'll argue that if you're going into the transformation zone on defense, the first thing you need to do is a massive cleanup to make space for offense. And so there's very realistically a chance that you go into the transformation zone and the first thing that goes there is your productivity portfolios with a massive cleanup, cost, and efficiency agenda in order to make way for the material forward movement of your actual, creative
Yep.
transformation.
And I think that's materially legitimate in every way, but it doesn't necessarily result in the creation of a new portfolio. So really, it's we're letting one of our portfolios behave as if it's in a different zone for a while.
Yeah.
Might be a better way of looking at that. But another one you reminded me of, though, is that is legitimate is the supply chain optimization play. And I've seen companies take a productivity zone supply chain management tool set, function, everything else that goes around it, and do some truly transformative things there that actually opens their supply chain as a profit center in a new way. So that is one case I've actually seen productivity zone example three cycle through and come out as both a platform and a BU portfolio on the other side.
So if we take this into a wrap and, you really take the conversation we've had across the first five episodes, a lot of what we've been doing, and to be honest, what we did in the many, many talks we had before we started actually recording podcast episodes was developing a common language. And, there have been times when we found that we were very aligned and times where we found that we were in a very different place. But we wanted a language to talk about portfolios with that enabled us to do something real. And,
Mhm.
this episode's been adding another significant piece to that language. We've gone beyond money, work, and people, materiality, and zones into quite specific examples of, six key, deliberately not use the word patterns that you might recognize portfolio with, and some of the connotations, right, where they happen to be perhaps tensions or synergies. We've run through in the performance zone the idea of the business unit portfolio, the variation of the channel portfolio, the regional portfolio, the regulatory and risk portfolio, not to be confused with the security function. We talked a bit about the single portfolio the whole of company in a single portfolio, and perhaps the moments where you might want to think about splitting that and reasons why you should resist jumping too fast to it. We headed into the productivity zone. We talked about platform portfolios, corporate system portfolios. It's kind of two nuances of example three. And then we managed not to get too caught up in innovation geeking out, as we talked about the innovation portfolio or example six from the article. And never forgetting that every concept we've talked about, you can apply to characterizing the portfolios in your ecosystem to start to build a picture of the way the ecosystem plays, but you can also start to apply them by characterizing the internals of a given portfolio. And in fact, when you think fractally, you might find that if a portfolio splits to multiple portfolios or a portfolio splits to other arts, that you'll see these concepts play out in that space. And next episode, we're finally going to talk about moving on from starting where you are. Uh, Everything we've talked about so far is a way of actually understanding where you are. And now you kind of have a clue where you are. You want to start to say, well, where would I like to go? And what are some of the moves I might make? And the whole idea is to actually, having understood where you are, generate insights and use those insights to make informed decisions about where next, which will be the topic of the next episode. So I thought it was going to be a challenge keeping us to our usual hour time box. We managed to contain ourselves to an hour and 20, so we didn't do too badly. But until next time, this has been Shaping Portfolio Agility, and we hope you've enjoyed the show.